What would you do if, just past midnight, a thin cry, barely more than a thread of sound, floated through a snowstorm and reached your ears? In a backyard split open by a square pit, a German shepherd stood rigid inside a steel cage, her body curled protectively around a trembling golden pup. Beyond the fence, a former Marine stared down at the cup of coffee cooling in his hands. He couldn't bring himself to drink. He listened. The sound came again, metal against stone, then stillness so sharp it felt like the air forgot how to move. No one else was coming. Only him. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Type your country in the comments below. And if you believe that no creature, human or animal, should ever be left alone in the cold, hit subscribe. This story might just renew your faith in second chances. The wind rolled down from the San Francisco peaks like a low, ancient horn, whispering through Flagstaff's ponderosa pines and combing January's snow into pale ripples. Porch lights glowed like halos in the freezing dark, and above them, the sky, a high desert black, was pierced by the disciplined geometry of winter stars. It was the kind of night when sound carried far, the dull hum of a distant highway, the faint rattle of a chain swayed by the wind, the brief clatter of metal striking stone. In the backyard of a weather-worn bungalow on North Isabel Street, Vera Kane was digging. Each stroke of her shovel carved a square-edged hole into the frozen earth, as though the rhythm of labor could drown the noise inside her chest. Vera was in her late 40s, tall but tapering at the shoulders from years of tension. Her face, once gentle, now looked carved, as if willpower alone held it together. She wore a wool coat buttoned unevenly at the throat, dark hair pinned with stubborn precision, and red gloves streaked with wet dirt. In public, she was the neighbor who brought cinnamon bread to the church drive and remembered birthdays at the community watch. She spoke softly to strangers and briskly to herself. But in private, her gentleness hardened into obsession. Years of being dismissed, an austere father, a loveless first marriage, had written a creed into her bones: order at all costs. Tonight, order meant digging a perfect hole. Beside that trench sat a steel crate. Inside, a German shepherd held her post like a small fortress wall before a smaller, shaking body. The dog's name at the clinic was Sky, though she'd been called a dozen others by softer voices in other kitchens. Good girl. Brave one. Hold on. Sky was 5 years old, large-framed but not heavy, her sable coat deepening into a charcoal saddle beneath the winter fluff. One ear tipped slightly, the other stood tall, an asymmetry that made her dignity almost tender. Her eyes caught the faint starlight and gave it back, the kind of dark eyes bred for discipline, for solving a problem before the handler even speaks. Even caged, she held her composure. Even trembling, she kept her body between danger and what she loved. The small golden thing behind her was Dory, a retriever pup not quite 6 months old, all paws and confusion. Her fur was matted with old rain, her tail wagging apologetically whenever Sky shifted. Dory had the open, foolish faith of her kind, round eyes, a milk-sweet muzzle, and the unshakable belief that love was the world's natural state, even when the world forgot. Her breath caught on the cold. A tiny whine slipped out, threading through the stillness. Sky pressed closer. Vera's shovel struck stone, chanked, a bright crack that sliced through the night air like glass against frost. Across the fence, in a neighboring kitchen that smelled faintly of pine and coffee grounds, Miles Granger stood barefoot on tile. He watched the kettle hiss over a chipped enamel pot, because steam, at least, followed rules. Miles was 35, a former United States Marine. His shoulders still bore the quiet squareness the Corps had hammered into habit. He looked like a man who'd been trained to be brave under orders, and was now trying to learn how to be gentle on his own. His hair, dark brown with a reluctant thread of gray, was cut to regulation once, now grown into something almost easy. His face was honest, tired, the kind that looked better when it stopped pretending. A scar lived near his left brow, showing only when fatigue dragged him down, which was most nights. His hands were large, practiced, steady enough to tie a knot fast or calm a frightened pulse. After his final deployment, he came home to Arizona with little more than a duffel, discharge papers, and a list of reasons to keep moving written in a hand he didn't want to recognize. Insomnia had followed him like a bunkmate that refused transfer. So he stayed up, keeping the dark company. His living room was half map, half memory, a topographical chart of Kachina peaks pinned above a scuffed dresser, a coil of rescue rope looped neatly by the door, a headlamp forever migrating from shelf to mug pile. Discipline ran through him like rebar, but civilian life had tiled over it crookedly. "Where'd you go, devil dog?" he muttered to the missing headlamp, then to the coffee scoop, then to the idea of order itself. The self-directed joke made him smile. That counted as progress. The kettle clicked off. And that's when he heard it. A faint, splintered cry, not quite a hinge, not quite a note, just a vibration stitched into the wind. Hypervigilance is many things, a gift, a curse, an unwanted instrument, but sometimes it's simply a whisper that says, "Listen." Miles set the pot aside and stepped onto the back porch. Cold air wrapped around his ankles. The neighborhood lay still beneath the tall pines. 2 doors down, a single window through a soft oval of lamplight across the snow, old Mrs. Nora Hensley's place. Nora was in her 70s, silver-haired, kind without ceremony. She had waited out grief and learned to pour tea into silence until it spoke. She liked Vera for her bread, the way you like a scent before knowing who wears it. Down the block was Hal Trujillo's closed woodshop, sawdust smell trapped like a blessing beneath the door. Hal, 62, broad-shouldered and soft-spoken, believed most problems could be solved with a square, a pencil, and patience. Above the clinic lot lived Tam Leary, a 31-year-old veterinary nurse with a lavender streak tucked under a practical bun, a woman who steadied her heartbeat so frightened animals could borrow it. This was the web of Miles's street, a quiet tangle of lives stretched under winter's breath. The sound came again, thinner now, sharpened by the cold. Miles crossed his yard, boots crunching, and crouched near the fence. On the other side, Vera's porch light buzzed like a trapped bee. Her silhouette bent over the square pit. The crate sat half in shadow, twin eyes glowing through the mesh. Sky met his gaze, calm, intelligent, assessing. Behind her, the pup shivered. The shepherd adjusted, widening her stance to cover the smaller body. Miles's vision tunneled around those eyes. Training, the months, the years of reacting before thinking, aligned into one clean instinct. Still, he checked himself. Maybe there was a story here he didn't yet know. Maybe he was seeing what he'd been trained to see. Then the shovel hit stone again. Chank. Dory flinched so hard her ear struck the bars. "Easy," Miles whispered, to the dogs, to the wind, or to his pulse, he wasn't sure. He looked back into his kitchen. On the counter, the coil of rope, the elusive headlamp, and a chipped mug that declared "World's Best Boss." "That's perjury," he muttered to it, and in that moment, the decision ceased to be theory. He moved to the gate. It was latched and frozen. He turned back to the fence, tall but climbable. He'd vaulted worse, in worse boots, for worse reasons. "Ma'am," he called quietly but firmly, giving the world one last chance to correct itself. Vera straightened. Her red gloves gleamed. "This is private property," she said too brightly, voice like a brittle bell. The shovel handle balanced against her thigh. "It's midnight," Miles answered evenly, "and there's a cage by a hole." Vera's eyes flicked, toward the crate, toward the light, toward the shadowed windows of her neighbors. She forced a smile, the kind you give to a cashier you'll never see again. "I'm training them. They dig. I'm correcting that." Through the wire, Sky held his gaze. He recognized the look, working dog math, fence height, shovel distance, wind direction, human intent. "They're not learning," Miles said quietly. "And that's not nothing." The wind carried the smell of creosote and cold iron. Somewhere, a freight train barked its distant metallic syllable. Vera shifted. Her red glove touched the crate latch. Sky didn't growl, she simply leaned, the canine version of a prayer. The shovel struck again, chink, louder this time, as though the ground itself was warning. Miles's body responded before thought could interfere. He'd learned what hesitation costs. 2 steps back for momentum. Powder underfoot. The absurd image of an ex-marine in wool socks vaulting a neighbor's fence flashed through his mind, and he nearly laughed. Then he jumped. He cleared the fence cleanly, landing in a spray of snow and cold breath. The posture of command returned unbidden, straightening his shoulders. And he spoke the word that begins every story people later tell on porches when they need to believe courage still lives in quiet places. Stop. Get out of my yard. Vera's voice sliced through the frozen air, sharp, shrill, and echoing down the stiff fences. Her red gloves flashed as she spun, pointing at Miles as if he were the intruder, not the one standing between her and the trembling lives inside the steel crate. You're insane. You broke into my property, she shouted, breath spilling in angry clouds. Her tall frame looked larger beneath the porch light's sickly yellow, her face stretched thin by years of rehearsed self-defense. The shovel leaned against the half-dug pit, its blade smeared with wet soil, but her eyes darted toward it like it was a loyal ally. Inside the crate, Sky had risen to her feet, her stance widening, her body an unspoken shield. Her fur bristled, tail low, ears pinned not in fear but in fierce concentration. Behind her, Dory pressed close, her small body quivering, paws sunk into the muddy bottom. Though trembling, she peered through the bars as if trust itself might change the odds. Miles's instincts took over. His hand went to the coil of climbing rope clipped at his belt, a habit, not a plan. Not military issue, just a frayed old rope he kept like a superstition. He flicked it open, looped it through the crate's front grate, and anchored it with a quick, practiced knot. Not tonight, he muttered under his breath, pulling hard. The rope hissed as it dragged across the snow and metal. Vera lunged forward, gripping the crate's edge and shoving with her full weight toward the open pit. They're mine, she screamed. Get away. Her voice cracked and carried down the sleeping street. Across the way, a light flicked on, Mrs. Nora Hensley's porch. The elderly widow, wrapped in her shawl, leaned on her cane and peered through the window, her eyes sharpening as she saw the struggle below. For a heartbeat she froze, then turned, limping quickly toward her front door. A few houses down, Hal Trujillo fumbled for his old flip phone, the one always left charging on his workbench. His steady baritone reached the 911 dispatcher even before he'd zipped up his jacket. Animal control, he said, breath fogging the receiver. Send someone to North Isabel Street, someone's trying to bury dogs alive. In Vera's yard, the fight tipped toward chaos. Miles braced himself, heels digging into the snow. The rope strained, every muscle in his back burning against her pull. Inside the crate, Sky pushed too, claws scraping the metal floor as she pressed her body toward freedom, toward him. And then, the strangest thing. As Miles pulled, Dory, the golden pup, licked his hand through the wire mesh. A small, warm, absurd gesture. Her tail wagged weakly, and for a second, the madness of it all cracked. Miles barked out a breathless laugh. Perfect timing, sweetheart, he whispered. Best buttermilk kiss I've had all year. The moment of lightness shattered as Vera shrieked again, grabbing the shovel. She swung wildly. The flat edge clipped Miles's shoulder with a dull thud, spinning him off balance. Back off, she screamed, her voice ragged. The crate rattled violently. The rusted latch, worn by time and neglect, gave way with a sharp metallic snap. The door burst open. Sky exploded from the crate first, paws digging into snow, body pivoting broadside to shield Dory from Vera's reach. The pup stumbled after her, sliding on the ice. Miles dropped the rope and lunged forward, arms open, catching Sky's momentum as she collided against him. Dory tumbled into the crook of his chest, small and frantic. Vera swung the shovel again, but the slick patch of ice betrayed her. Her boot slipped. She windmilled her arms, barely catching herself on the rim of the pit. Snow puffed around her in a white halo. Miles and the dogs went down together in a heap, snow exploding outward. The impact drove the air from his lungs. Sky's body landed across his ribs, Dory's paws scrambled against his chest. For a moment, he could hear nothing but their heartbeats hammering against him, their breathing rapid and alive. Then came another sound, low and distant at first, then growing. Sirens. Their long, rising wail sliced through the pines, bouncing off rooftops, threading its way toward this frozen street. It carried promise, of authority, of help, of consequence. Vera froze, shovel still clutched tight, eyes darting between Miles and the distant flashing lights. Her breath came in short, desperate bursts. For the first time that night, her voice faltered. Miles stayed where he was, snow melting into his clothes, the dogs pressed close. Sky lifted her head, muzzle dusted white, eyes sharp but calm now that her pup was safe. Dory yawned in his arms, absurdly innocent, then licked his nose. Miles exhaled, a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. "Guess we're all in it now," he murmured, staring up at the barren winter sky. The sirens grew louder, until red and blue light washed over the yard like some strange dawn. A city-issued truck skidded to a halt. Tires crackled over the ice. Out stepped Rhea Maddox, animal control officer, late 30s, wiry, compact, her dark hair pinned beneath a knit cap. Her gray uniform was scuffed from years of field work, her eyes were steady, but soft around the edges, the kind that had seen too much cruelty and refused to look away. "Step aside," she ordered calmly, crossing into the yard. 2 patrol officers followed, younger and nervous. Vera pointed, frantic. "He broke in. He attacked me, he's stealing my dogs." Rhea ignored her. She crouched beside Miles and the animals, her gloved hands moving gently, efficiently. "Easy, girl," she murmured, her tone smooth as river water. Sky's ears twitched, she stayed still as Rhea looped a soft lead around her neck. Dory whimpered and pressed closer into Miles's coat. Rhea reached into her satchel and pulled out a wool blanket patterned with faded paw prints, wrapping the pup carefully until her trembling slowed. "We'll get them to the clinic," Rhea said, meeting Miles's eyes. He nodded, jaw tight, still half in disbelief. The patrolman led Vera toward the porch. She screamed, struggled, then sagged when the cuffs clicked shut. Her red gloves hung limp. Rhea guided Sky and Dory into the back of the truck, her movements brisk but kind. Miles followed on instinct, every nerve still running hot. The drive through Flagstaff blurred past, dark pines, neon reflections in icy puddles, the soft hum of the heater. The town slept beneath its winter quilt while their headlights carved through the night. At last, they pulled into a small building glowing faintly under a buzzing sign. Coconino Veterinary and Emergency. A neon paw print, blue and green, flickered against the dark. Inside, the air was warm, thick with antiseptic and cedar bedding. Posters of smiling cats lined the walls, but the waiting room sat empty. From a back door emerged Tamsin Rivera, the on-call veterinarian, late 20s, lean, her dark curls trapped in a messy bun, cartoon paw prints on her scrubs, and exhaustion deep in her eyes. "Oh, God," Tamsin breathed, seeing Sky's ribs showing beneath her coat. "Bring them in." Rhea and Miles carried the dogs to the exam room, where bright light reflected off metal counters. Sky stood stoic on the table, her tremor slight but constant. Dory, still wrapped in the blanket, was lowered into a padded basin lined with towels. Miles hovered at the door, shoulders stiff. He couldn't step farther in, the fluorescent light made him feel exposed, as if every scar on his body had learned to flinch from scrutiny. Tamsin moved with quiet command. Her hands, small, steady, sure, parted Sky's fur to reveal abrasions, malnutrition, and faint rope scars that ringed the neck like shadows. "See this?" she murmured to Rhea. "Old friction burns. Frost damage on the pads, too." Skye didn't resist. Only her eyes flicked to Miles, as though checking he was still there. Tamsin's voice softened into Spanish. "Buena chica, casi termina," she whispered. "Good girl, almost done." Meanwhile, Dory whimpered until an assistant brought out a ridiculous fleece blanket shaped like a pink donut. The pup burrowed inside, tail wagging weakly, comforted at last by the silly warmth. Miles's mouth curved into a crooked smile. He hadn't expected to feel anything tonight. Rhea moved quietly, snapping photos, injuries, crate fragments, the rusted shovel, plaster casts of footprints. Each piece of evidence slipped into labeled bags. Finally, she inserted a small USB drive into the monitor. "Let's see it," she said. Grainy footage filled the screen, Vera's yard framed by snowflakes. A hunched figure thrusting a shovel again and again into frozen soil. The crate visible near the edge. The image flickered, but the story was unmistakable. Even Tamsin paused her work. "Dios," she whispered under her breath. Rhea exhaled slowly. "That's enough to hold her," she said, voice steady. "It's not just your word anymore, Granger." For the first time all night, Miles felt his lungs expand fully. He sat down heavily on the bench by the wall. Skye, sensing the shift, stepped down and padded to him. She rested her head across his boot, eyes closing in trust. Miles blinked hard. His throat tightened, but it wasn't fear anymore. Rhea finished her report, neat handwriting filling the forms. "You'll both need to sign as witnesses," she said briskly. "For now, they're safe here." Miles signed. The sharp lines of his marine handwriting wavered for the first time in years. Outside, the neon paw print hummed faintly against the cold. Inside, something had changed. What began as one man's reckless leap into a stranger's yard had become evidence, testimony, and the first stirring of a town's awakening. In the basin, Dory sighed, a tiny, content sound, and drifted into sleep. For the first time, sleep did not mean danger. Morning in Flagstaff broke clean and sharp, sunlight spilling across the San Francisco peaks like fire over glass. The storm had passed, but a thin crust of snow still glazed the sidewalks as townsfolk hurried toward the sandstone steps of the municipal courthouse. The modest two-story building, with its green shutters and brass bell above the door, looked almost too small for what was about to unfold inside. The air smelled of pine oil and cold paper, half reverence, half routine. Inside, at the defendant's table, Vera Kane sat hunched like a scolded child. Her mascara had run down her cheeks in black rivers. She wore a powder blue cardigan and a string of pearls that clicked faintly as her hands trembled, a last attempt to look respectable. She had spent years crafting the image of a gentle neighbor, the woman with cinnamon bread and Sunday smiles, but the act was slipping. "I was only tending my garden," she murmured to no one in particular, voice fragile as spun sugar. Across the aisle, Rhea Maddox stood straight-backed, uniform pressed, expression calm and unreadable. Her brown hair was neatly brushed, her gray eyes steady, the gaze of someone who had seen cruelty before and had learned to anchor herself against it. Beside her sat Miles Granger, no longer in uniform but unmistakably a Marine. His posture was erect, his jaw set. He wore a plain jacket, his hands rough and scarred, better suited for ropes and rifles than courtrooms. He looked out of place among the polished benches and brass railings, a man used to acting, not arguing. Presiding at the bench was Judge Harold Connors, a sturdy man in his early 60s with thinning white hair and a chest built from years of ranch work before the law found him. His voice carried gravel and gravity in equal measure. He had little patience for theatrics. "We are gathered for a preliminary hearing on charges of animal cruelty," he began, adjusting his spectacles. "This court will determine temporary custody pending trial." The benches behind him creaked as the townspeople shifted. Some leaned forward, eager for justice, others crossed their arms, uneasy about condemning a neighbor they'd long assumed kindly. Among them sat Mrs. Nora Bishop, wrapped in her heavy shawl, her posture tall despite her age. Her silver hair was wound tight in a bun, her eyes sharp as frost. Next to her was Hal Durkin, the lumberyard owner, plaid shirt stretched across his solid frame, his expression carved with quiet disapproval. Further down, a slim young woman in a green jacket, Janine Harper, one of Vera's old church acquaintances, whispered to a friend, "She always brought pies." "Can't be true." When Rhea rose, the murmuring fell away. She handed the clerk a folder thick with photographs, veterinary charts, and intake notes. "These documents confirm prolonged malnutrition and injuries inconsistent with neglect alone," she said evenly. "They are consistent with deliberate restraint and deprivation." Then she placed a small USB drive on the evidence table. "This contains doorbell footage from the night of the incident." The clerk inserted it. The monitor flickered. There was Vera, bent over a pit, her shovel driving down through snow-hardened ground. The crate loomed beside her. For a heartbeat, the camera caught her face lit by the porch bulb, jaw locked, hair plastered to her cheek. The sound was silent, but the motion spoke volumes. A wave of gasps rippled through the courtroom. Vera's hands fluttered to her eyes. "That was snow clearing, nothing more," she said, her voice cracking, tears carefully timed. "My dogs wander." "I was." Her lawyer, Patrick Lowe, a tall man in an expensive gray suit, placed a hand on her arm. He was known in town for his smooth voice and perfect hair, less for his success rate. "My client," he said, turning toward the judge with theatrical gravity, "is a generous woman who has been gravely misunderstood. Shadows, snow, and noise at night, anyone might mistake them for malice." Judge Connors gave no reaction. His pen tapped once against the desk. Then came Miles's turn. He rose slowly, boots heavy against the wood floor. "I heard a whine," he said, voice clipped, steady. "I looked over the fence. I saw her pushing the crate toward the hole. The shepherd was shielding the pup. I didn't think, I jumped. No embellishment. No drama. Just the truth, distilled to its hardest edge." The silence that followed was heavier than argument. Even Vera's lawyer hesitated, his well-oiled words faltering in the face of something unpolished and real. That was when Nora Bishop rose from the benches. Her cane struck once against the floor. "I've lived 76 years in this town," she said, her voice rough but sure. "And I know the difference between a good woman baking bread and a dangerous one digging holes at midnight. A decent soul doesn't stand over crying creatures with a shovel." The room shifted. Whispers turned to nods. Something in the air changed, from uncertainty to conviction. Judge Connors inclined his head. Statement entered into record. At that moment, the side door opened. Rhea gestured to the bailiff, and the dogs were brought in. Gasps rose again, this time softer, almost reverent. Skye walked first, lean but proud, the bandage at her neck a pale contrast to her sable coat. She moved with the controlled grace of a soldier on parade, then lowered herself at Miles's feet without command. Behind her bounded Dory, golden and clumsy, patches of fur still uneven but spirit irrepressible. She trotted straight across the courtroom, sniffed the carpet, circled twice, and collapsed beside the defense table with a sigh loud enough to draw laughter. As Patrick Lowe shuffled his notes, Dory rolled over and promptly fell asleep across his polished shoes, snoring softly. The young attorney froze, helpless. Chuckles rippled through the room. Even Judge Connors cracked a ghost of a smile before clearing his throat. When the laughter faded, what lingered was the contrast, between innocence unafraid and deceit unraveling. Judge Connors leaned forward. "This court will not determine final guilt today," he said, voice low and deliberate. "But the evidence before me speaks clearly regarding immediate welfare." He turned toward Vera. "Temporary custody is revoked. The animals will remain under foster care until trial. Considering Mr. Granger's role in their rescue, and the testimony from animal control, I assign him as caretaker under supervision." Vera made a strangled sound. "No. You can't." Her pearls clattered as she reached for the table. Lo whispered urgently in her ear, but the decision had already landed. The gavel struck. Crack. The sound filled the room, final as thunder. Miles exhaled, slow and deep. His hand fell to Sky's head, she leaned into the touch, calm as if she understood. Dory blinked awake, wagged once, then fell right back asleep. Outside, the courthouse bells chimed noon. The snow still lingered on the steps, but the air felt lighter, as if something unspoken had shifted. For the first time, Flagstaff seemed to understand what silence had cost it. The first mornings at Miles Granger's house were quiet, wrapped in the silver hush of Flagstaff's high-country winter. The peaks loomed above the tree-line, sharp and white, their crowns veiled in slow-moving clouds. Frost laced the fence posts, and the air smelled faintly of pine sap and thawing snow. From his porch, Miles watched his breath drift away like steam from a memory. The house behind him, small and cluttered, had once been a place he merely slept in. Now it was alive with new sounds, the tap of claws on hardwood, the rattle of a food bowl, the occasional soft huff of a shepherd dreaming. Inside, Sky moved with deliberate grace, her paws whispering against the floorboards. Her coat, sable and silver, caught what little morning light filtered through the curtains. She was still cautious, still scanning every shadow, but the tension that once strung her body like wire was easing. The scars along her neck, thin pale ridges beneath the fur, were nearly invisible now. Across the room, Dory was chaos incarnate. Barely 6 months old, still all ears and enthusiasm, the golden retriever pup bounded across the kitchen with a mismatched pair of socks clutched in her mouth. She dropped them proudly at Miles's feet, tail wagging like a banner of victory. Miles sighed, then chuckled. "You're gonna run me out of laundry, Private." He bent down, tugging the socks from her mouth, and she immediately tried to lick his face instead. Her tongue missed, her tail didn't stop. The small, ridiculous joy of it all made him laugh, a real laugh, unguarded and alive. He hadn't heard that sound from his own throat since Afghanistan. The house was changing. So was he. The walls, once lined with relics of his service, a folded flag, maps, medals he never talked about, now had signs of life scattered between them, a half-chewed tennis ball under the chair, muddy paw prints drying near the door, a dent in a couch cushion where Sky preferred to lie. Order had always been his armor. But now, disorder had begun to look like proof of love. Training began with patience. On the trail beyond his backyard, among the ponderosa pines, Sky stood alert but uncertain. When Miles gave the command, "Stay," she quivered at first, her instincts torn between obedience and the old fear of punishment. He held her gaze, steady, kind. "You're safe. It's just training, girl. No one's gonna hurt you again." When he released her with a low, "Okay," she bounded forward through the snow, tentative at first, then freer with each stride. Dory, of course, ignored every command, tripping over her own paws and chasing her tail until both of them collapsed in a pile of joy and frost. "Hopeless," Miles muttered, smiling despite himself. "You're both hopeless." That winter, the neighborhood began to thaw in more ways than one. Hal Durkin, the lumberyard owner, arrived one afternoon with cedar planks in the back of his truck. "For building them a run," he said, unloading the wood without waiting to be thanked. "Dogs need Sky more than fences." Miles tried to protest, but Hal's look silenced him. "Let me work," he said simply, and started measuring. Tamsin Ward, the young veterinarian with auburn hair and glasses that never stayed straight, stopped by every few days to check on the dogs. She knelt in the mud without hesitation, her gentle hands moving over Sky's healing scars. "Good girl," she murmured. "Almost there." Dory immediately flopped into her lap, leaving muddy paw prints on her scrubs. Tamsin laughed. Guess I asked for that. And then there was Mrs. Nora Bishop, wrapped in her wool shawl, who appeared one morning with a tin of waffles still warm. Real waffles, she said firmly, placing them on his counter. Not the kind people use to hide their guilt. Miles blinked, unsure how to respond. Yes, ma'am. Don't yes ma'am me, she said, eyes soft but steady. Feed your strength. They'll need it. Each day folded into the next, slow, ordinary, healing. Skye began sleeping through the night without pacing. Dory grew bolder, finding every sock, glove, and scrap of paper worth stealing. Miles's routine, walks at dawn, feedings, repair work, built something quiet but unbreakable between them. But not every day was easy. One night, a storm swept down from the mountains. Wind howled through the pines, sleet hammered the roof, and loose siding banged against the house with a metallic clang. The sound, too much like a shovel striking stone, sent Skye bolt upright. Her ears flattened. Her body shook. She paced the room, panting, tail tucked tight. Miles set down his lantern and crouched beside her, lowering his breathing until it matched the rhythm of calm. Hey. Hey, it's all right. His voice was low, even, deliberate. You're safe, Skye. You're home. He placed one steady hand against her chest. His warmth anchored her. Slowly, her breathing synced to his. The tremors eased. At last, she pressed her face into his palm, a surrender not to authority, but to trust. For a long moment, they stayed like that, a soldier and a survivor, both relearning what safety felt like. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, the house held its peace. By morning, the storm had passed. The world glittered again under new snow. Miles stood at the window with his coffee, watching Dory race in wild circles through the drifts while Skye trotted after her in a slower, more dignified gait. The sight pulled a quiet smile from him. Healing, he realized, was not something that came all at once. It came in circles, like Dory's endless loops through the snow, messy and joyful, but always returning home. By the time spring rolled across northern Arizona, Flagstaff had shed its heavy coat of snow. The air held the sharp scent of thawing earth and pine needles. In the heart of town, the library, an old red brick building with tall windows and a brass bell over its door, glowed with lamplight against the chill evening. Inside, folding chairs filled a makeshift meeting room where hand-painted banners hung from the walls. Across the front, written in navy and gold, were the words. Pause at the door, hear the cry. Knock. Don't turn away. The idea had been Rhea Maddox's. Weeks after Vera Kane's conviction hearing, she'd sat awake at her desk, replaying the night in her mind, the call that came too late, the crate half buried in snow, and the sound of shovels that neighbors had chosen to ignore. She decided silence itself had to be confronted. So she called Miles. Then Tamsin. Then Mrs. Nora Bishop. Now, the four of them stood before a gathering of neighbors, some curious, some uneasy, some just there to listen. Rhea opened the meeting with her usual, level calm. She was dressed in her uniform jacket, dark hair tied back, her voice carrying authority that didn't need to be loud. We live in a community where silence has cost lives, she said simply. Human and animal. Pause at the door isn't about blame, it's about responsibility. If you hear a cry, you don't dismiss it. You stop. You knock. You ask. The words fell heavy, then settled deep. Tamsin Ward, the veterinarian, stepped forward next. She was young, auburn braid draped over one shoulder, glasses sliding down her nose as she smiled at the crowd. Sometimes all it takes is a moment of courage. You don't have to be a rescuer or a soldier. You just have to care enough to check. At her feet sat Skye and Dory, calm and radiant under the library lights. Skye, now strong and confident, sat poised beside Miles like a sentinel, ears forward, posture proud. Dory, barely 7 months old and still clumsy, wagged so hard she nearly toppled herself over. The contrast was perfect, discipline beside delight. Children in the audience laughed softly as Dory spun herself in a circle before collapsing against Sky's paw. Miles stepped up last, broad-shouldered in a worn flannel shirt, his presence filling the room with quiet steadiness. In the core, he began, discipline kept us alive. But discipline without compassion breaks people. It breaks animals, too. When you hear something, someone crying, something wrong, you don't wait for someone else to move. You move. His voice wasn't loud, but it struck like a nail driven into oak. The audience grew still. Then the stories began to surface, hesitant confessions at first, like pebbles dropped into water. A middle-aged man with weathered skin admitted, "I used to hear barking from Vera's yard. Thought it was just training. Didn't want to get involved." A young mother spoke next. "I heard it too. I just turned up the TV so my kids wouldn't ask questions." At the back of the room, a pale woman in a green coat raised her voice. Her hands shook slightly. "I heard whimpering weeks before it happened," she said. "I wanted to go check, but I was scared. I thought I might be wrong." Ria's eyes softened. "You're here now," she said. "That's the first step." The woman, Sarah Whitmore, nodded, tears bright in her eyes. By the time the meeting ended, the crowd had shifted. Flyers were handed out, phone numbers shared, pledges signed. People lingered long after the chairs were folded, talking in quiet, thoughtful voices. The air carried something different now, a current of resolve. As Miles and Ria packed up the banners, Ria's phone buzzed. She frowned, reading the number. "Anonymous call," she murmured. "West Side. Dogs crying in a backyard." The caller hung up before I could ask more. Miles didn't hesitate. "Let's go." Tamsin grabbed her medical kit. "I'm coming." Outside, the night was sharp again, the kind of cold that smelled of chimney smoke and pine. The trio moved quickly through the sleeping streets, headlights gliding across snow patches that hadn't yet melted. Sky trotted ahead on her lead, nose twitching, tail low and alert. Dory bounded beside her, tripping once, catching up again, determined to be part of whatever came next. They reached a small row of houses on the western edge of town. Most windows were dark. Wind tugged at loose wires and half-collapsed fences. Behind them came the sound of footsteps. Sarah Whitmore had followed, coat pulled tight, face pale under the streetlight. "I know this area," she whispered. "People here, keep to themselves. If someone actually called, it's bad." They turned down an alley where chain-link fences bordered patches of wild scrub. Sky stopped suddenly, ears pricked, nose lifted. A faint whimper floated through the wind, thin, frightened, but real. "She's got it," Miles said softly. Ria moved ahead, careful but fast. They found the source, a small backyard half hidden by a leaning shed. Through the gaps in the fence slats, two shapes quivered beside a rusted barrel. Puppies. One barked hoarsely, the other pressed flat to the dirt, trembling so hard the sound barely reached them. Ria jimmied the latch open with a practiced hand, pushing the gate enough for Sky to slip through first. The shepherd moved slow, lowering her body, tail down, ears forward, a living signal of peace. The pups froze, eyes wide. Dory, ever impulsive, bounded forward, then stopped when they squealed. She dropped instantly onto her back, paws up, tail thumping, a pup's way of saying you can trust me. The two little rescues crept forward, sniffing Sky's muzzle, then Dory's. A quiet moment passed, fragile, sacred, and then the smaller one leaned into Dory's warmth. Miles crouched beside them. "It's okay," he murmured. "We've got you." He scooped both pups into his arms, their bodies shivering against his chest. Ria wrapped them in blankets from her truck, tucking them in until only their wet noses peeked out. When the animal transport van arrived, Sarah stood a few feet away, hands clasped to her chest. "I should have come sooner," she whispered. "I won't wait next time." Mrs. Nora Bishop, who had insisted on riding along despite the cold, placed a steady hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Then don't," she said. "Next time, you knock." The sirens faded into the distance. The wind eased. Sky and Dory trotted side by side toward the truck, tails high. For the first time in months, the street felt lighter, like the town itself had exhaled. Silence had been broken, and something stronger had taken its place. The courthouse in Flagstaff rose like a pale stone anchor against the brittle blue of late winter sky. Its steps were worn smooth from decades of boots and snow, its flag snapping in the dry mountain wind. Inside, the air hummed with a low current of tension, neighbors whispering, papers rustling, the shuffle of feet against polished floorboards. This wasn't just another case. It was the trial that had turned the town's gaze inward, forcing it to ask why so many had stayed silent for so long. Vera Kane sat at the defense table, her frame stiff, shoulders drawn tight beneath a navy shawl. Her hair, once carefully dyed, had grown dull at the roots. Her lips were pressed thin, and her hands clenched the hem of her skirt until her knuckles blanched white. She had perfected the look of frailty, eyes wet, mouth trembling, but up close, the act showed its cracks. Her eyes darted from face to face, calculating, fearful, unrepentant. Presiding was Judge Miriam Calloway, a tall woman in her late 50s with short silver hair and eyes like tempered glass. She didn't need to raise her voice to command silence, her stillness did it for her. A widow of 15 years, she carried her authority like a well-balanced blade, fair, but unyielding. The proceedings began with the rhythmic shuffle of papers and the murmur of the clerk's voice. Case of the state versus Vera Kane, charged with animal cruelty and neglect. Rhea Maddox was called first. She took the stand in her gray uniform, hands steady, voice level. The court reporter's keys clacked softly as Rhea detailed what she had seen that night, the half-dug pit, the rusted crate, the trembling animals. She spoke not as an accuser, but as someone who had carried too many scenes like it. She listed the veterinary reports, photographs, and the doorbell footage that had captured the truth in cold, grainy silence. The injuries on the German shepherd's neck, she said, were consistent with repeated restraint and friction burns. Malnutrition was significant. Frostbite evident on the paw pads. Her tone stayed calm, but anger hid beneath its evenness, not fiery, but the slow, steady kind forged by years of seeing what people preferred not to see. When she stepped down, the room held its breath. Next came Tamsin Ward, her auburn braid slipping loose over one shoulder as she swore in. She described the condition of the animals at intake, the shepherd's stoic endurance, the golden pups trembling, the moment both of them fell asleep for the first time without fear. Her voice faltered only once. Even after all that, she said softly, they still wagged their tails when someone spoke gently. They still believed love was possible. A quiet ache rippled through the benches. Then came Miles Granger. When he stood, the courtroom straightened with him. He wore a clean flannel shirt, his hair trimmed, but the old posture of a Marine still lived in his spine. His calloused hands gripped the railing of the witness box as if it were an anchor. He told the story simply, the cry in the night, the shovel sound, the hole, the decision that didn't feel like a choice at all. I saw her pushing the crate toward the pit, he said. The shepherd was trying to shield the pup. I didn't think. I just moved. No theatrics. No anger. Just truth. When he said Sky's name, though, his voice softened, and even the judge looked up from her notes. Across the room, Vera's attorney, Patrick Lowe, rose for cross-examination, immaculate in his tailored suit, his voice smooth as silk. My client, he began, is a lonely woman who has been misrepresented. The dogs arrived in her yard already malnourished. She panicked. The video is. Enough, Judge Calloway interrupted. Her tone cut through the performance cleanly. Stick to questions, counselor. Lowe's charm wavered. The defense tried to paint Vera as misunderstood, a widow of quiet habits, unfairly judged by gossip. But their argument couldn't stand against the evidence, the video, the scars, the witnesses who had finally stopped pretending not to hear. Then the court called Mrs. Nora Bishop. She rose from the front bench, her cane tapping once against the wood floor. Her shawl wrapped tightly around her thin shoulders, but her voice was iron. "I've lived in this town 77 years, she said. And I know cruelty when I see it. A good neighbor doesn't dig holes at midnight with cries echoing through the snow. You don't call that discipline. You call it what it is, cruelty." The silence that followed was absolute. When Nora stepped down, even the defense lawyer's eyes dropped. Judge Calloway adjusted her glasses, scanning the stack of reports before her. "The evidence is comprehensive," she said quietly. "The testimony consistent. The footage undeniable." She set her pen down. "This court finds Vera Kane guilty of animal cruelty and neglect." The gavel fell like thunder. Vera flinched. Her mouth opened as if to protest, but no words came. Her lawyer whispered something, but she didn't hear. The performance had collapsed, all that remained was the woman who'd buried her mercy long before that night in the snow. Judge Calloway continued, her tone softer now, but no less firm. "You are hereby prohibited from owning, keeping, or housing animals indefinitely. The sentence reflects not only your actions, but the silence you demanded of others." When the gavel struck again, the town exhaled, long and deep. Then came the quieter part, the one that mattered most to the heart still healing in that room, the matter of guardianship. Rhea stood again, smile faint but proud. "Mr. Granger has acted as caretaker for both animals since the incident," she said. "Their recovery under his care has been exemplary." Tamsin nodded from her seat. "They know him. They trust him." From the gallery, Mrs. Nora spoke once more. "They chose him. That's all that matters." Judge Calloway looked at Miles, then at the two dogs waiting patiently near the front of the room. "Then it's settled," she said. "Full adoption granted." Miles's breath hitched. For a man used to facing chaos without blinking, this moment unsteadied him. He stepped forward, knees stiff, hands trembling just slightly. He knelt, not before the judge, but before the dogs. Skye met his eyes, regal and calm, then lifted her paw and placed it on his hand as he fastened a new collar around her neck, leather, engraved simply with her name. Dory, ever the comet of joy, launched herself straight into his lap, licking his chin in wild celebration. The courtroom broke into laughter and applause. Even Judge Calloway allowed herself the hint of a smile. Outside, sunlight poured over the courthouse steps, melting what snow remained. The townsfolk filtered out into the cold with warmer eyes than they'd arrived with. For them, this was more than justice. It was absolution. On the steps, Miles paused, Skye steady at his side, Dory bounding ahead like sunlight in motion. He drew a slow breath, the high desert air clean and cold in his lungs. For the first time since leaving the Marines, he felt something rare and simple, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. A year later, Flagstaff had learned to listen. Spring climbed the slopes early that year, painting the ponderosa pines in brighter greens and filling the air with the wet sweetness of thaw. The mountains still wore a crown of snow, but the valleys below hummed with life, farm stands reopening, bicycles on the trails, laughter echoing through open windows. On the corner of Maple and Cedar, what had once been Vera Kane's house stood transformed. The sagging fences were gone. In their place, neat rows of lavender lined the yard, swaying like a small purple sea. A cedar sign hung from the gatepost, carved by Hal Durkin's own hand. The Sky Haven. A sanctuary of second chances. It wasn't large, just 3 fenced kennels, a shed rebuilt into a treatment room, and a shaded patch where dogs could lie under the aspens. But it was enough. The town had built it together, plank by plank, weekend by weekend. Kids painted the walls, retirees donated tools, Tamsin wards supplied medicine and laughter in equal measure. At the center of it all, Miles Granger knelt by a water trough, tightening the last bolt. He had sun on his shoulders now, lines at the corners of his eyes that came from smiling rather than squinting. Skye lay nearby in the grass, watching him with that steady, measured gaze of hers, protector turned matriarch. Dory dashed in and out of the kennels with 2 rescue pups tumbling after her, tails a blur of joy. "Easy, kid," Miles said, wiping his hands on a rag as Dory skidded into his leg. "You're supposed to teach them patience." Dory barked once as if to argue that joy was better than patience. From the gravel drive came the sound of an engine cutting off. A gray city truck rolled in, door marked Animal Control, Flagstaff District. Rhea Maddox stepped out, crisp uniform under a fleece jacket, coffee in hand. She took in the yard and smiled. "Didn't think you'd finish before June." "Finished last night," Miles said. "Couldn't sleep till it was done." She nodded toward the lavender rose. "Smells like forgiveness." He grinned. "Maybe that's what we've been planting." They walked the perimeter together, checking locks, watching the new rescues play. The wind moved through the flowers, carrying bees and the low hum of the town beyond. Later, Tamsin arrived with her battered medical bag and a thermos of soup. She crouched to check the younger pups, murmuring soft nonsense as they nipped her sleeves. "They look good," she said. "No tremors, good weight." "You're spoiling them." Miles shrugged. "I'm just giving them what I wish someone had given Skye." At noon, the gate creaked again. Mrs. Nora Bishop shuffled in, wrapped in her old shawl despite the mild day. She carried a small brass plaque under her arm. "Made this at Hal's shop," she said. "Thought we'd place it today." Together they chose the bench under the aspens. Nora set the plaque into place and brushed the dust from its letters. "In memory of the ones we heard too late. May silence never win again." No speeches followed, no applause, just the quiet, honest kind of silence that comes from peace, not neglect. Rhea sat on the bench beside Nora, sipping coffee, eyes distant. "You think people keep listening?" she asked. Nora's gaze followed the dogs racing through sunlight. "They will," she said. "Once you've learned to hear pain, you can't unhear it." By afternoon, the sanctuary filled with visitors. Children knelt to pet Skye, who tolerated their affection with queenly patience. Dory presented every guest with a stick, insisting on fetch as admission. Miles moved through the crowd with easy steps, laughing when someone asked if he trained the dogs himself. "Not exactly," he said. "They trained me to show up." As the sun slid behind the peaks, the light turned copper, catching on the lavender and the fur of running dogs. The day softened. People drifted home, leaving the place wrapped in the gentle rhythm of evening, bark, breeze, birdsong, quiet. Miles sat on the porch steps with Rhea and Tamsin, boots dusty, coffee cooling in their hands. The lavender swayed. Skye rested her head on his knee, Dory slept half across Tamsin's shoes. Rhea broke the silence first. "You ever missed the service?" Miles thought a long moment. "Some parts," he said. "The purpose. The team. But this feels like the mission we were all supposed to come home for." They watched the stars appear, one by one, until the sky mirrored its namesake lying at his feet. From somewhere down the street, a dog barked once, sharp and brief. Another bark answered. Then silence again, content, not fearful. Flagstaff had learned to listen. And in that listening, it had learned to heal.